Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It is a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to get back to your phone calls momentarily, but it is also a great pleasure to welcome back to the program, after too long an absence, a man who's been nice enough to share time with us. If you wondered who it was that might have influenced Donald Trump, even over the objections of his daughter and his son-in-law, to get out of the Paris Climate Agreement, I think we'd have to give most of the credit on that to Myron Ebell, who is the director of the Center for Energy and the Environment at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he led the presidential transition team at the EPA. Myron, it's good to have you back on the program.
Thank you, Lars.
Am I wrong in giving you a lot of the credit for influencing the president's thinking on where he should go with regard to Paris?
Oh, I think so. You know, the president last May 26th, 2016, gave his first major policy speech. This is right at the point when he had secured the nomination, and he'd never given a policy speech throughout the nomination process. And he gave a big one in Bismarck, North Dakota, on energy and environment. And one of the top promises was, as president, I will cancel the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, the problem has been that since he took office, there are a whole bunch of people who don't want him to cancel the Paris Climate Agreement, and some of them are in his administration. Some of them are, the leaders of major European countries. So he's been under a lot of pressure. So what we did at CEI was try to buck him up and support him. So I wouldn't say I influenced him. We just gave him the support I think that was necessary for him to be able to make that decision last week.
Well, let's give my audience some nuts and bolts on this. Isn't the Paris Agreement largely symbolic when it comes to both the United States and the other signatories?
Yes and no, and I think mostly no. It's a funny agreement in that each country of the 196 parties, each country picks its own targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so we made a commitment, the Obama administration made a commitment on our behalf in 2015 to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below the 2005 level by 2025. And all of the actions undertaken by President Obama through regulation and executive order would get us about halfway there. So a whole bunch of further actions to raise energy prices and limit the use of energy in this country would be necessary before 2025 to meet that target. And some people on our side said, well, it doesn't really matter because it's voluntary. But no, it's a commitment. It's an international commitment. And one of the things that came out during the discussion over this within the White House, so one of the points that we kept making is, and by the way, that EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, who used to be the Attorney General of Oklahoma, so he's a top lawyer, the argument that we made was it may be voluntary, but once it's an international commitment, it's going to be used by environmental pressure groups to enforce the Obama agenda in federal court. And so there's some symbolism involved, but there's also some very dangerous consequences.
So,
moreover,
especially for a society like ours with the system of courts, whereas in China, if China makes a commitment, do they even have the same kind of structures that would allow, say, a Chinese environmental group to bring suit against the Chinese government to force them to do something other than whatever it is they're going to do?
No, we're the only country in the world that allows private citizens to enforce laws against the government, and that includes international treaties and agreements. So, no, but by the way, I'm glad you brought up China, because China's promise, their commitment under Paris, was that they promised that their emissions will keep going up as long as they want, but that they would peak by 2030. So Chinese emissions surpassed U.S. emissions in 2006, and they're now almost double our annual greenhouse gas emissions, and they promised under Paris that they'll keep going up. So that's the kind of agreement it is.
It sounds like a terrible agreement, and then on top of that, you've got a situation where this was never submitted to the United States Senate. I mean, why is it that President Obama was able to simply define this as an agreement although the Constitution assumes presidents will make agreements, but they're called treaties, and they have to be signed off on by 2/3 of the Senate. He managed to dodge that, and the conservatives and Republicans never found a real answer for that, although I always thought the answer would be put it to a vote and vote the thing down.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That is the key point, and I think one of the problems with the Senate Republicans, particularly Majority Leader McConnell, is that they were unwilling to do that. And I think one of the arguments that they continually used was, well, we only vote on things that the president sends to us. So if President Obama doesn't send it to us, we won't vote on it, and therefore we're going to pretend that it's not a treaty and really get out of our constitutional responsibility in that way, or just ignore our constitutional responsibility. Now, I think the problem with President Trump's speech last Thursday in the Rose Garden is that he did not. He said several times, including back in the campaign last year, that one of the problems is that that the Obama administration had gone ahead with the Paris Treaty without sending it to the Senate. But last week, when he said we are withdrawing, he did not say he was going to send it to the Senate. He didn't say he wasn't going to send it to the Senate, but he didn't say he was. So I think that's a problem. And I think he did say, though, that the U.S. is not going to fund the Green Climate Fund, and that's a real positive. Of course, Congress would never put up money for the Green Climate Fund anyway. Our share starting in 2020 is $23.5 billion a year. But it's good for all these developing countries who are basically part of the agreement because they want to get paid. It's good that they now have been put on notice that they're not going to get that money. And people like Michael Bloomberg have said, oh, we'll put it up. Well, let's see all our leftist billionaires come up with $23.5 billion a year.
Yeah, good luck with that. Myron Ebell, by the way, is the director at the Center for Energy and Environment at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's hosting a lunch in Portland this coming Friday on June the 9th. You can get tickets by going to cascadepolicy.org. Myron, let me ask you a couple of other nuts and bolts for people, because when this happened, when the president announced we're pulling out of this agreement, which really was a treaty and which was never ratified, there were people who acted as though it was the end of the world. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this thing went into effect on the 4th of November of last year. It hadn't had time to have any real effect, other than the things that Obama was doing anyway through the EPA aimed at reducing greenhouse gases and all the rest of that. So is this the end of the world, or is that just a little bit of an exaggeration?
Well, first of all, if every country that has undertaken serious commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions fulfilled those commitments, it would have no measurable effect on the amount of warming that there would be by 2100. On the other hand, the estimates are it would cost the global economy between $1 and $2 trillion per year for no effect. So the treaty is all pain and no gain, and the sooner it collapses, the better. And so the United States, in my view, under President Trump, is leading the way to a brighter future and not wasting $1 trillion or more dollars per year. Because after all, if we weren't putting all this money into reducing emissions by replacing inexpensive energy with more expensive energy, then we would lots of things good things could happen in the world. With all that money could be invested in, for example, electrifying those parts of the world where people don't have any electricity at all, like parts of Africa, large parts of India, and some parts of Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of good that could be done in the world if some of that money went to a better cause. And the other thing I would say about this is the arguments of the environmentalists and of people like Al Gore and some of the Obama administration officials and some of the Europeans has been, well, this agreement doesn't really mean anything. It's totally voluntary. The U.S. shouldn't pull out because it's meaningless. On the other hand, it's the most important agreement ever signed in the history of the world, and you're committing treason if you pull out. So, they can't have it both ways.
If you want to get a chance to hear Myron Ebell in person, he's at a luncheon in Portland this coming Friday. You can get tickets at cascadepolicy.org. Myron, thanks for the help you gave to the Trump transition, and thanks so much for the time today.
Thank you, Lars. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. Back in just a moment, we'll get to your phone calls and emails. Maybe I'll even hear from a naysayer who thought the Paris Agreement was a great idea and can explain to me why cutting the world's economy by $1 trillion is a great thing, especially for those people in the poorer parts of the world. 866-439-5277. Emails go to talk@larslarson.com. Portland's best traffic comes from Jordan Schultz on FM News 101 KXL.